They said we can just shoot at 2 o'clock.
At 2 o'clock.
Yeah.
That's right.
All right. I'm going offline now, Prof. Quiet now. So you can start at 2 when you're ready.
Certainly. Wow. Our planet is broken. Our system is indeed broken. We want systems change, not just climate change. That's the reason that we are discussing this afternoon on the roundtable that we entitled Asikhulume. It is the eighth series of the roundtable, and the discussion is moderated by myself. My name is Thenjiwe Meyiwa. I'm the Vice Principal responsible for research and postgraduate studies and innovation, amongst other things. I'm not going to mention commercialization. The reason that we're here, of course, is because of the climate change. We have titled this what could we do things differently from the human rights point of view. And of course, this will not have happened at a better time than when we've just come out of Shama, of COP27. And hence the topic that we're having this afternoon, climate change and human rights in post-COP27 regime. Dumelang, Sanbunan, Absheng, Jambo, Bonjour, wherever you are across the globe, within the country, South Africa, and within the continent, more so because the African Union expects of us to be doing things differently. We are congregated this afternoon with a panel of experts who are going to share with us this very worrying topic. We've titled it climate change somehow, but if anything, you will agree with me, ladies and gentlemen, that it's not just climate change, this is climate crisis. We are in a crisis, and the very first picture that I showed before I started, a picture of a child. What kind of a planet are we handing over? We know that the previous generation becomes very important for the next generation in terms of handing over, taking the baton to the next generation. The question that I'm bringing to everyone that, of course, was very much reverberated at Shama in Egypt earlier on this year is the fact that science is becoming clearer. We saw with COVID. Science is contributing so much. Scientists bring about change. Scientists bring about responses and answers, but climate impacts are becoming more devastating. In my mind, on one end, we have the science that's doing well. On the other hand, we have the very science and its people not being able to respond to devastating climate change impacts. And of course, the costs of this are worsening. I have a panel of experts with me here this afternoon who are well skilled to be able to engage in this subject, who are going to be assisting us in saying, what do we need to do? Or what do we need to stop doing from destroying ourselves, from destroying the planet, and from destroying the next generation that are expecting to be handed over the planet that we are continuing to destroy in the fashion that we have. With the COP27, if you are following the discussions, there were agreements, a number of agreements made, but so was the case with COP26. And the question is, how are we moving forward? The sustained reductions that we need, the global greenhouse gas emissions that we have, how are we reducing all of these? Interestingly, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, as you're all over the platforms, the University of South Africa, which I serve, and on behalf of the Vice Chancellor, Professor Puleng Linkebula, sends a message to everyone and says, actually, since this morning, we had a sustainability indaba where, as a university, interacting with other universities and science councils that we invited around the country, we were asking, the journey has become a race against time. It is now time for us to be looking at what action we need to take. Indeed, as we've just finished of wrapping up the indaba on a similar subject of sustainability of our planet, we are posing these questions, and indeed, I'm hoping that the panel members that we have this afternoon will assist us in looking at the three pillars that we have of sustainability. How do we impact them differently? The environment, economics, social aspects, and impact on people. And the African Union that I made mention of earlier on, taking from the United Nations, talks of sustainability development goals. And therefore, without wasting much time, I am wanting to introduce to you, I will not take all of the panel members, but it will be one panel member after another. And I'm suggesting that rather we have one and then questions posing to one that would have been introduced and presented their thoughts, solutions, work that they've done in terms of really what kind of data, I'm just thinking as a researcher, that we need to ensure that this carbon footprint that we have takes a turn. What turnaround could we do? What role do you possibly can have individually, wherever you are, to ensure that the projects that we have, that my colleagues shall be responding to, and that Prof Duben shall be also responding to as a respondent, a key respondent, we shall be looking at all these matters as an inclusive issue, this sustainability that we need to have. So to start off, we are going to have Jessica Lawrence. Jessica Lawrence is a managing attorney of the Environmental Rights Program, Lawyers for Human Rights. Hence, we're twinning this with human rights, the topic that we are about this afternoon. So Jessica's topic is on understanding human and general environmental rights, global and South African perspectives. Jessica is going to take us through this topic. Jessica, having always been guided, just to take you through a bit about her resume, having always been guided by a strong sense of what is fair and just, she's gone on to pursue a career as a human rights attorney, whose efforts are geared towards the most vulnerable members of society. Jessica Lawrence joined the Lawyers for Human Rights in 2014 and is currently a practicing attorney managing Lawyers for Human Rights Environmental Rights Program. She is responsible for the overall management of the program. This program focuses on environmental justice for marginalized communities and individuals. Jessica seeks to promote, as you will concur when she takes you through her thoughts, she seeks to promote and enforce the constitutional environmental right, as well as a just distribution of environmental benefits and burdens that our society generally gets to experience. In addition, Jessica is also responsible for identifying appropriate strategic litigation cases, particularly in the field of environmental and climate justice and business and human rights, with a focus on the extractive sector. In 2019, Jessica completed a master's degree in human rights and constitutional law through the University of Johannesburg. She hopes to make a positive contribution to developing the law in the field of business and human rights and in changing the landscape of environmental and climate justice in South Africa. I now, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, wherever you are, want to hand over to Jessica to take us through her beliefs as I've laid them out. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Prof Meyiwa, for that introduction, and thank you very much to the University of South Africa for inviting me to speak on this panel. And welcome to everyone who is joining us this afternoon. I am just going to share my screen. Well, as indicated in the introduction, I am going to be speaking about the intersectionality of human rights and environmental rights. The United Nations Human Rights Council has emphasized that climate change is an urgent global problem requiring a global solution. The Council has also called for international cooperation in order to implement the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is known as the UNFCCC. And this is to implement and to support national efforts for the realization of human rights, which are affected by climate change. The UN Council further affirmed that human rights obligations, standards, and principles have the potential to inform and strengthen any international, regional, and national policymaking in the area of climate change, promoting coherence amongst policies and ensuring sustainable outcomes. Just briefly, why would we incorporate human rights into climate change-related actions? Human rights are universal legal guarantees that protect individuals, groups, and people against actions or omissions that interfere with their fundamental freedoms and entitlements. Human rights law obliges governments, principally, and other duty bearers, such as businesses, to respect, promote, and protect and fulfill all human rights. We know that human rights are universal and are based on inherent dignity and equal worth of all beings. They are equal, indivisible, interrelated, interdependent, and cannot be waived or taken away. And this is the foundation of our framework and thinking around climate justice. As indicated in the introduction, it is now beyond dispute that climate change caused by human activity has negative impacts on the fulfillment of human rights. Climate change has profound impacts on a wide variety of human rights, for example, the right to life, self-determination, development, food, health, water and sanitation, and housing. The human rights framework requires that global efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change should be guided by relevant human rights norms and principles, including the right to participation and information, transparency, accountability, equity, and non-discrimination. So simply put, climate change is a human rights problem, and the human rights framework must therefore be part of the solution. As I mentioned in my previous slide, states who are the primary duty bearers, as well as other duty bearers like transnational corporations and other businesses, have an affirmative obligation to take effective measures to prevent and to redress the impacts of climate change. Therefore, to mitigate climate change and ensure that all human beings who are rights holders have the necessary capacity to adapt to the climate crisis, and that any sort of climate justice requires that climate action is consistent with existing human rights agreements, standards, principles, and policies. What is incredibly important to understand when talking about climate justice is that those who have contributed the least to climate change unjustly and disproportionately suffer from the harms of climate change. Those persons must therefore be meaningfully participated with and consulted with as primary beneficiaries of climate action. It is also important that they have access to effective remedies. States have an obligation to respect, protect, fulfill, and promote all human rights for all persons without discrimination. Therefore, a failure to take affirmative measures to prevent human rights harms caused by climate change is in breach of states' obligation. States have a responsibility to mitigate climate change, and this includes through regulatory measures in order to prevent the greatest extent possible the current and future negative human rights impacts of climate change. Therefore, states must take appropriate adaptation measures to protect and fulfill rights, particularly for those most endangered by the negative impacts of climate change, such as those who are living in vulnerable areas, as well as future generations, like the picture that we saw in the beginning. States have a further responsibility to build adaptive capacities in vulnerable communities, including by recognizing the manner in which factors such as discrimination and disparities in education and healthcare affect climate vulnerability. And in doing so, they need to devote adequate resources to the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights of all persons, particularly those who are most vulnerable and at greatest risk. During COP27, South Africa acknowledged that, like other vulnerable regions, Africa needs to build adaptive capacity, foster resilience, and address the loss and damage caused by climate change. In order to achieve this, South Africa and the continent will need a predictable, appropriate funding stream, as well as technological support, which I will speak to in a moment. This must support our right to development and international equity with regards to the just transition, ensuring that it is inclusive. So what this does is it places a great responsibility on developed economies to honor their commitments to those countries with the greatest need, and that it confronts the greatest environmental, social, and economic impacts of climate change. Developed countries are also the countries that have contributed the most towards climate change. So what principles in human rights law apply to climate change? I've listed a couple of important international legal frameworks, such as the UN Charter, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, International Covenants on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as well as the UN Declaration on the Right to Development, the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, the Vienna Declaration on Program of Action, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the ICCESCR. And you will note from these that a lot of these are linked to the right to development and the right to equality and equity. Specifically looking at the ICSCR, it states that everyone has the right to enjoy the benefits of science and its applications. All states should actively support the development and the dissemination of new climate mitigation and adaptation technologies, including technologies for sustainable production and consumption. And this is something that the South African government specifically spoke to at COP27. It's very important that environmentally clean and sound technologies should be accessibly priced. The cost of their development should be equitably shared, and their benefits should be fairly distributed between and within countries. So technology transfers between states should take place as needed, and it should be appropriate to ensure a just and effective international response to climate change. Then the UN Framework Convention on climate change calls for states to protect future generations and take action on climate change on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Again, what this looks at is it acknowledges that vulnerable communities disproportionately shoulder the burdens of climate change, and those that are least impacted by climate change have contributed the most towards it. Whilst climate change affects people everywhere, those who have contributed the most to it are those that are least affected. And this is why acknowledging this is part of the discussion of equity and climate action, which requires efforts to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change for the benefit of developing countries and indigenous people and those living in vulnerable areas. Equality and non-discrimination is a central aspect in environmental and climate justice, and states have committed to guarantee equality and non-discrimination in their response to climate change. Efforts to address climate change should not exacerbate inequalities between and within states. For example, indigenous people's rights should be fully reflected fully reflected in any country's response to climate change as called for in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and actions that will likely impact their rights should not be taken without their free, prior, and informed consent. And FPIC is something that is called for by a lot of Indigenous and affected communities, and that they have the right to say yes or to say no to development, particularly because they shoulder the burdens of any type of development, as well as climate change. Care should also be taken to ensure that a gender perspective, including efforts to ensure gender equality, is included in all sorts of plannings of climate mitigation. And of course, the rights of children, older persons, minority, migrants, and all those who are in vulnerable situations ought to be effectively respected, acknowledged, and protected. So the basic human rights principles that we see in our international law, which speaks to equality and non-discrimination, require action to address remedy, particularly because they face or shoulder disproportionate impacts of climate change. And so when developing our response to climate change, we need to take this into consideration. The UN Common Understanding, which is emphasized by key human rights principles that I have spoken to, but also principles like universality, indivisibility, independence, non-discrimination, participation, accountability, and the rule of law, outlines a conceptual framework for development based on international human rights standards in order to promote and protect human rights. A human rights-based approach requires that we acknowledge what obligations states have, what inequalities and vulnerabilities affected communities have in order to seek redress of discriminatory practices and unjust distributions of power. And also to take into consideration our response to climate change, ensuring that those who are most vulnerable are not further marginalized by any attempts to address climate change. Among the human rights that are being threatened, I've already spoken about a few of them, but they include adequate food, safe drinking water, sanitation, the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, which includes sexual and reproductive health, adequate housing, self-determination, favorable and just conditions of work, development, the right to a clean environment, a right to a healthy and sustainable environment and livelihood, as well as education and cultural rights. I think it's really important to understand how the climate impacts human rights in order for us to understand why human and environmental rights are intersectional. Climate change also contributes to human rights violations with specific adverse impacts on women and girls and against marginalized groups, as I mentioned, migrants, minorities, indigenous groups, people of African descent, people with disabilities. And climate change can exacerbate the risk of other human rights violations, like trafficking, placing women and children specifically at risk, policing at climate rallies, systemic racism, and contemporary legacies of colonialism, which negatively impact the right to a healthy environment and therefore continue to have an impact on people's ability to enjoy their human rights. At COP27, there was a lack of commitment, and this has been criticized by a lot of civil society members as well as academics, that there has been a lack of commitment by states that have been the primary historical contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. The current nationally determined contributions provided by parties as per the Paris Agreement remain seriously inadequate to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the negative effects of failing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are disproportionately suffered by communities and vulnerable people, as I have already indicated. However, a very positive development at COP27 was the historical deal of establishing a loss and damage fund to support those who are most at risk to the effects of climate change. And this is incredibly significant. And earlier this year, on the 29th of July, 2022, important steps were taken at the General Assembly, which recognized the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which includes the right to a safe climate as a human right. And this was incredibly significant. And therefore, the loss and damage fund is an important step to realizing the right to a clean and healthy and sustainable environment, which of course is a constitutional right, but now has been recognized as an international human right. Some of the things that came up from COP27 and a way forward for future COPs is the need to urgently step up the mitigation action, so to reduce emissions in line with countries' common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities. Include human rights considerations in nationally determined contributions and other planning processes. Establish a loss and damage fund, which has now been done. Call for climate finance to address mitigation and adaptation. Allow for the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples and civil society, including human rights defenders, grassroots organizations, and women-led organizations in decision-making processes at all levels of COP, as well as internally within your respective countries. Affected communities have the right to determine what happens to the land they own and use, the right to free, prior, informed consent regarding any action that may or may not negatively impact them or positively impact them. Then we need to address systemic racism and provide justice and reparations to victims, including those whose health has been affected, and avoid entrenching racial injustice while addressing the climate and ecological crisis. This is a really important aspect to environmental justice. We need to include children and youth representatives and their delegates to the future COPs to ensure that young people have a say in their own future. We need to exercise restraints when policing climate action protests and assemblies. And we need to bridge the gap between countries' stated levels of climate ambition and their plans to address the impact from food systems on climate change by transitioning to agroecology. And again, that last point speaks to what I mentioned earlier about the importance of the just sharing of technology and information relating to climate change and climate action. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, for that. It could not have actually rhymed so well. Jessica makes reference to justice for climate change and ethics related to that. I'm going to allow 2 questions, appreciating the fact that we haven't responded in Prof Thenjiwe, and also appreciating that some colleagues are attending through YouTube. I will allow 2 questions, if there are any, to pose to Jessica, if at all, in terms of what she's shared with us in relation to the human rights framework. She's spoken about principle in law and cited prescripts that are very much linked to development and equality and equity, and for the need to attend to those that are vulnerable. Jessica, in the absence of, I'm not seeing any hands up, you've made reference to the fact that there's unjust distribution of power, and you've also made reference to the need for adhering to these prescripts that you cited, decrying the fact that there is discrimination, and somehow as a human rights attorney under the Lawyers for Human Rights, you're making mention of all of this. I'm interested in how within your work you have found, if at all, where there is distribution of power, bearing in mind that mostly as the African continent, in South Africa in particular, we are not just only culprits on one end, but more from your sharing with us, recipients of all the bad that's happening as it relates to all the emissions that we have to deal with and the repercussions that come from that. Would you say that within the country, for instance, and with the work that you've done with the human rights lawyers, have you found any trends changing towards some power being taken to account and distributed somehow?
So within the South African context, there still remains to be huge power disparities between affected communities and specifically businesses. If I could use the example of the extractive sector, we know that mining companies are one of the biggest contributors to climate change. And we know that mining affected communities who host mines in their backyards are most affected by mining operations. So not only do they have a mine operating on their land or the land that they own or they use, which will be either on their property or on their back doors, we know that they have to shoulder the burdens of the impacts of mining, which is environmental degradation, impacting their livelihoods, such as subsistence farming, can cause environmental degradation, water contamination. And what we have seen through our work is that often mining companies who have a responsibility towards the community to ensure the community's development and upliftment through social and labor plans, which is a requirement for a mining right, that they do not respect those obligations in terms of the social and labor plans. So what mining affected communities are calling for in South Africa, and we have seen this as well in other communities across the continent and the global south, is that communities are calling for the right to say no, the right to free, prior, and informed consent. Communities should have the right to choose the type of development that they want. And at this stage, they do not have that right. So I think that there's still quite large disparities, and that is something that we're trying to work on changing together with mining affected community groups.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm aware of all the great work that you've been doing that has stalled a number of environmental ills that we would have otherwise experienced. There is a hand from Dr. Lowe, Thelma Lowe. I'll take that hand, please, Thelma.
Thank you very much, Chair. Jessica, perhaps a bit of a double-edged question. You know, and I absolutely agree with what you're saying regarding the rights of communities to be heard. Yet, you know, when we talk about cleaner energy and moving away from coal-fired power station, there has been a lot of opposition to that also, because, for example, your coal truck drivers say they're going to lose their jobs. So how heavily does that right of them to have a continued employment weigh against the rights of the community to not have coal-powered stations? So this conflict between rights, just your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Dr. Lowe. I think that's an excellent question. And my response to that would be that we have to look that we support development, of course, but it cannot be at the expense of human rights. And I think that it really is a balancing of interests and a balancing of rights. And in the context of a green economy, what we would call for is that affected communities, and those are the host communities and immediate surroundings of a mine, for example, are included in the decision making of, you know, renewable energy or companies that are a part of the green economy, and that they specifically create employment and job opportunities within the green economy. So, for example, truck drivers who have previously been trucking or transporting coal, they should be incorporated into whatever is needed, you know, for the just transition. So, I would foresee that there would still be a requirement of the transport industry with the green economy. So I think it's really just companies and states being mindful of including marginalized people or affected communities in the green economy. So they should be purposely trying to create employment opportunities within the green economy. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, you have, but I think what we tend to forget sometimes, and that is what makes it difficult, is there are often people that have a vested interest in retaining the status quo and are then stoking fears within these individuals and communities that end up in violence even often.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jessica, for that. I appreciate. Colleagues, we move forward with the next panel member. That is Prof Namo. That's Godwin Namo. Prof Namo is Exxaro chair. Prof Namo, if you could, for the benefit of some colleagues that may not know what Exxaro stands for, he's an Exxaro chair in climate and sustainability transitions at the University of South Africa. And he's talking to us about climate change related loss and damage and implications on vulnerable communities in Southern Africa. Prof Namo has been instrumental in bringing about the charter that the University of South Africa has, and has been very vocal, radically so, which I appreciate, in terms of getting the University of South Africa to consider be on board with a number of international persuasions and initiatives as it relates to climate changes. Prof Namo is a full professor and chief researcher, aside him being a chair of Exxaro Center for Climate and Sustainability Transitions in South Africa. That's what I call it because it's a center to me. He is a National Research Foundation C-rated researcher, undertaking research in the fields of COVID-19 and tourism. Climate change and sustainable development is actually, in my book, his primacy. Prof Namo has published 17 books, 13 edited and 4 co-authored, and over 101 journal articles since 23. He is a mentor of note that the university prides itself with him having graduated 12 doctoral students and is currently hosting 11, 10 plus 1 postdoctoral fellows. That's huge. Prof Namo is also one of the experts for the non-economic losses group under the UNFCCC, also International Mechanisms on Loss and Damage. Prof, you'll take us through all these big words that you are ascribed to. And just recently, he's participated in a number of international debates that relate to climate change. He has over 25 years of experience in the academic and consulting spaces, engaging as an advocate of open access educational resource and more resources, and more recently, of course, as open access to challenging policy and also bringing about policy briefs himself and writing pieces that are quite accessible, that we have been very privileged within the Unisa Press. Hence, we are presenting this roundtable this afternoon with them, where we have published some of his very accessible work. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, allow me to hand you over to the Exxaro chair, Prof Namo, please, sir. You are mute, Prof.
Am I unmuted now?
Perfect.
Can somebody confirm if they can hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, thank you. I just decided to put my video so that you know that you are not talking to a ghost. I'm going to switch it off now, and as I beam the presentation. Thank you so much, Jessica, for that wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed the talk, and what Professor Meyiwa did is exactly why I don't want to give program people my CV, because they waste a lot of other time talking about things. I always say your CV must follow you. It should not go ahead of you. So since the time we were presenting the program, the topic changed slightly to encompass a broader perspective on net zero emissions by 2050. So I will talk around climate justice, loss and damage, net zero emissions by 2050, and implications on vulnerable communities in Southern Africa. In case I forget what net zero is, to explain to those that are listening, it's a time where we want the world to have a situation where the amount of harmful greenhouse gases that we emit are going to be equal to the amount of harmful greenhouse gases we remove from the face of the earth. So there are a number of ways in which we remove these greenhouse gases from the face of the earth: through renewable energies, through matters like protecting our forest, and through matters like carbon capture and storage. So these are some of the technologies and methods or ways that we are going to be reducing some of the harmful greenhouse gases. So I'm saying by 2050, if you're having imaginary graphs, you should see those graphs meet the graph of carbon emissions and the graph of carbon sinks or removal. They should meet somewhere there in 2050, where then we've got a 0.0. So this is why we're talking about net zero emissions by 2050. I think loss and damage, Jessica has already touched on that earlier on. I'm hitting a neg here because although even we tested the, okay, now it's moving. Now, my presentation is going to basically these 5 key points. I usually want to start by the 5 key pointers I want everybody to take home. And when I finish by those 5 key pointers, I've already finished what I want to say to the participants or in my presentation. Then there's going to be part A, climate change related loss and damage, of course, and human rights, or in the context of human rights. Part B, pathways to net zero emissions by 2050 in the context of human rights. I might touch also on the issue that Thelma raised on just transition, core, and all that kind of stuff. Then, of course, putting it all together and possibly conclude. Here are the 5 pointers I want us to take home. The harsh realities of climate change are being witnessed every day in Southern Africa and also other parts of the world. Climate change is also inseparable, inseparable links to the attainment of 2030 agenda and also the agenda 2063, Africa Agenda 2063. While loss and damage, L&D, remains contested, with some still questioning the evidence in bodies like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and UNFCCC, time has come for us to close ranks and ambitiously address this issue. There is evidence that tropical cyclones, floods, tornadoes, and other slow onsets and extreme events like droughts, sea level rise, etc., are on the rise or on the increase in Southern Africa and globally. And lastly, the race to net zero emissions by 2050 is on, and Southern Africa must engage with it. I'm putting Southern there in brackets so that I'm also talking about South Africa. So Southern Africa and South Africa must actually engage with much thought, and also we must engage with much care. Just a bit of context there. We speak about the Africa Agenda 2063, of which aspiration 2 has actually issues embedding climate change, sustainable development in them, and other issues that concern human rights, peace and security. I'm not going to dwell much into this. It's just presenting us with the context. There are the Sustainable Development Goals, which is basically a continuation from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, or the unfinished business of the MDGs to the SDGs. And of course, SDG 13 is specifically dedicated to matters around climate change or climate action, but we have got other SDGs also that are linked to that. From Paris Agreement in 2015, there are 3 major issues that came up and others that are surrounding them. The first one basically is around the global goal to phase out greenhouse gas emissions to net zero. We can now add by 2050 after COP26. We are also talking about global goal to build resilience. We've got adaptation, mitigation. Then we've got support, including the Green Climate Fund, which is the GCF in that circle, and other issues around capacity building and transparency. Now, there comes the issue when we're talking about climate change and human rights and net zero emissions by 2050. We talk a lot around the fossil fuels or the fossil fuels sector, which includes coal. And the arguments that have emerged now throughout the world, especially when we were going to COP26 last year, the issue was we need to ban coal. Then when we went to COP26, India brought a very interesting concept to say, but this is a resource that we have. We can't just like have a hard landing. And then the debates, of course, went on. And the argument then that came from COP26 was, no, let's now talk about the coal drawdown. So we're saying they were now talking about the kind of a soft landing that we need. And of course, with the coming in of Ukraine and Russia, there have been other matters now that have made to say, okay, we are being told to remove our pedestal from the coal accelerator, yet actually the world demands, especially the EU, is now in need of this so-called dirty technology, which are being called from the African. When I say we, I'm talking from people from the global south. We are told to remove our accelerator, our pedals from the accelerator. Then there's also another issue around the emerging crude oil discoveries. Uganda, you mentioned Tanzania, even gas and all that kind of stuff. Right now in East Africa, there's a big project on the East African crude oil pipeline that is going to come from Uganda all the way to Tanzania. Now, when we're talking about climate change related loss and damage, there are issues that we need to understand that gives us the background of what we need to do. Now, one of the matters that has come is like this, what we call slow onsets. So if you can follow clearly on that diagram, the slow onsets are those that are in black. So when I talk about slow onsets, these are events that are happening, but we will not see them on a daily basis. Things like sea level rise. You can't go to the sea now. You can't go to Cape Town. You can't go to Mozambique. You can't go to Lagos and see the sea rising, because it does not do that overnight. So it's a slow onset. Desertification. You can't go to the desert and see the desert taking place. It does that overnight. Increasing temperatures. Things like salinization, land and forest degradation, loss of biodiversity, glacial retreat. These are ocean acidification. You won't see them, but they are taking place. Then there's what we call extreme events, and those are things like storm surges, tropical cyclones, droughts, things like floods, things like heat waves. These we can see, hailstorms, we can see. So when you talk about loss and damage, we also then categorize them into economic loss, where you've got business operations, agricultural production, tourism, and other physical assets like infrastructure, electricity, property being damaged, resulting in financial loss. Then also you've got what we call non-economic losses, things like life, health, human mobility, cultural heritage. All these things, then they form under the non-economic loss. So there's an issue about three major issues I want to pick from this slide: slow onset events, extreme events, economic losses, non-economic losses. So then I'm going to run down through to just give us some of the evidence that is coming from the continent in terms of this increasing loss and damages. Here we're looking at tropical cyclones. The major cyclones we know in Southern Africa, basically it's Cyclone Elin. It happened in 2000. And of course, there was quite a lot of infrastructure damage. But the other cyclone that is fresh in our minds is Cyclone Idai. And that is just a map showing you the pathways of these cyclones in countries like Madagascar, countries like Mozambique. They're actually at the core face when it comes to cyclones. But what is interesting there, these are some of the pictures that were flighted in 2019 after Tropical Cyclone Idai. This is actually a photo that's before and after one of the major farms, which also had the second largest sawmill or timber sawmill, which actually was disappeared into the flood waters of Cyclone Idai. This actually damaged electricity infrastructure, which actually disappeared. Transformers were washed away during Cyclone Idai. And of course, some of the increasing issues that are there in terms of the floods in Southern Africa and also globally. The trends show us that these things are increasing at quite a sharp increase. This is actually part of our published work. But I want to draw us to the recent floods in KZN that in April. So there are also issues that are not only talking about the vulnerable or poor communities. We have seen during the destruction of property in floods that even upmarket properties were not spared in terms of the intensity and the increasing risk of floods. And also even the transportation sector, we saw containers being washed away. And of course, the biggest issue, the loss of life. Over 400 people that lost their lives. But some of the issues that emerge from these issues, like how then do we deal with the aftermath of such tremendous and impactful extreme weather events like the KZN floods or like Tropical Cyclone Idai? How long are people going to be staying in transition or temporary shelters? Issues around when the donors bring foodstuffs or handouts, matters of rotten food being distributed or expired foods being distributed, matters about expired medicines being distributed, matters about the old being vulnerable, the women and children, the disabled being vulnerable. All these are matters of human rights. In Zimbabwe now, people are still battling in terms of identifying the loved ones. Some of them were buried in Mozambique, some the bodies disappeared and they might never be found. But the laws that we have in our countries, I think these are some of the issues that maybe lawyers for human rights must speak. When the laws were done before climate change, for you to declare a person dead, there must have been a passage of 5 years. So you see a person being swept away by the flood, but for you to go to the legal legal side of issues, then you can't say this person is dead. You see the person being swept up the flood, but the law says this person is living until there is what? There is 5 years that have passed by for you to be granted that order. But it has got impacts in terms of benefits. How do you then take your benefits if your husband was working, or if your wife was working, or if somebody was working, or if somebody was a breadwinner? Then all those issues, they are issues of human rights and also issues of loss and damage. Just closer home here, for those that are in Pretoria, Centurion Hotel, this hotel is still closed up to now. Since 2019, there were serious floods there, temporarily opened, but I think because of COVID, it was closed, but still the matter of floods has not gone away. So they are now trying to build flood barriers, of which the business, when we talk about loss and damage, from 2019 to now, this hotel, actually I visited this hotel 3 weeks back, it's closed and people have lost their jobs, and maybe business also has been lost. In terms of like the slow onset we're talking about, remember, I said you don't see the sea advancing. This part of the work we've published with my team, but you see the impact of the sea advancing. We have got that infrastructure. This is Cape Town. So some of these rail lines have been abandoned completely. So when you talk about loss and damage, and at a localized level or a national level or a provincial level, this is what it means. If you have to relocate infrastructure, if you have to relocate people, then we are saying new policies at a national level, provincial level, state level need to be put in place. I am temporarily forgetting about this idea of saying loss and damage, let's have the developed countries help us. I'm still at the level where I'm saying, let's help ourselves first before we can even talk about help from elsewhere. I think Jessica covered that nicely when she did her talk. Now, moving quickly to the matters that are also quite hot property now in terms of what is happening in the country. We're talking about the JETP. This is the Just Energy Transition Partnership, or Just Energy Transition in general, or Just Energy, Just Transition. So we have seen there a lot of matters that have been steered by the fact of us wanting to move from towards pathways of net zero emissions by 2050. Now, there are lots of issues that come from the net zero emissions by 2050, but today I just decided to maybe zero in and talk about justice for the green African metal sector. Now, before I even go further in terms of that particular sector, the mining sector, Jessica also highlighted the matter of the injustices that happen to the mining communities. I've just tried to flight this headline from 18 November. It was published by News 24. This is a South African media outlet, online media outlet. The headline there was saying, "I wait only for death. Residents despair as DRC is Democratic Republic of Congo. Cobalt mine seeks to expand." So the cobalt is part of the green metals. So apart from the fact that there are other issues that are going to come in my presentation, the real other challenges we face is that mining communities at times abruptly or deliberately ignore human rights. So when remember, most of our mining legislation are draconian by nature. They are a constitution unto themselves. So we discover diamonds at Unisa, you might discover that the buildings might have to give way. And the mining laws also don't even give us some of the rights in terms of the depth of how much we can claim, where even my house is sitting. So these are some of the human rights contentious issues that I say we need to address in the context of climate change. Now, why are we bringing mining and climate change and net zero into the picture? The fact is, because we want to go to net zero, there's been a new gold rush towards what we call green metals. And of course, these green metals are the ones that are driving the net zero transition emissions by 2050. Now, why am I saying these green metals are important? When we look at the properties, what their uses are, they are the ones that are actually now on serious demand, to the level that you see there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of investment in trying to access these green metals against a background where the communities that are actually within these areas at times are violently removed by governments, with the assistance of the police. And of course, we know that in terms of international trade, there's what we call the law or the rule of the most favored nation. So the rule of the most favored nation is like we protect these foreign investments. So we can easily raise our police, raise our soldiers, or even armed forces to force communities out of areas where they would have been designated mining areas. But also in our laws, there are serious binaries that also need to be addressed in the general mining area before even talking about climate change. Things like zamazamas, a common terminology that even some of the people that are in this platform used, and miner. So the guy who brings big machines and opens a big car like one in Kimberley, leave it there, these are miners. But the small guys who try to make ends meet, get into these old mining shafts, of course, they're called zamazamas, Makorongoza in Zimbabwe, and other derogatory names that we can come, Haramsi in Ghana. So we are saying that before even we start talking about the bigger agenda of human rights, there is also issues around human rights in terms of how our laws are structured in terms of referring to that. Now, these are some of the green metals that we're talking about: cobalt, vanadium, lithium, copper, nickel. And we are saying these metals, apart from the fact that as the global south, or as Africa and South Africa, we are actually assisting in making the world better by reducing carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. We have got a human rights issue in the first place to say our contribution actually is not even recognized globally. So we have got still a situation where people think the continent or other countries are not doing enough in terms of moving towards net zero by 2050. But I think as a continent and as a country, especially South Africa, these actually deposits, these mineral deposits are in abundance. And I think the fact that we are exporting this is actually good enough for us to make or to lay a claim that we are actually contributing towards the net zero. And so as such, we should not have then a backlash where when the loss and damage fund that Jessica spoke about coming from COP27 comes with the conditions to say then we want a report that should tell us how much are you moving towards net zero. We are already contributing a lot towards net zero. Now, there are some issues that when we talk to human rights, we need to bring up. This actually is quite a challenging slide to many people, because my argument here is saying, as we are going to be addressing human rights, we've got issues about people being abused in mining areas, but we've also issues around our wealth being taken out. It's almost like a slave trade, but in a mineral form. During the times of slave trade, people were being exported, taken by force. But now slave trade is gone, but we've got other means of slavery. And these are issues around the minerals, green metals, and other minerals being taken away from the continent, communities within these mining areas not benefiting enough. I'm underlining the word not benefiting enough there, because the argument said they've been employed is always there in the literature. But I'm saying we need to go beyond employment. We need to go deeper and say these local communities need a stake in these resources, so that their benefit can go many steps further than that. Now, there are many issues that are coming there. Just for those that want to know why there's a rush in terms of green metals, we've got things like lithium, which is an ingredient in lithium-ion batteries used also in smartphones and electric vehicles. Cobalt produced, copper and nickel is also another essential component in lithium-ion batteries. Nickel batteries as well. And of course, it's going to be a large proportion in the future. Manganese, we've got batteries, electric vehicles. Copper in wiring, motors, and coins. Then we've got rare earth metals. So all these green metals are saying they are raising lots of human rights issues in terms of where they are being mined, in terms of why they are being just exploited, and in terms of the countries of the South, especially Africa, not benefiting enough and having people languishing in poverty. When I'm putting it all together, these are now the issues that are coming. As we talk about loss and damage, some infrastructure is going to be completely destroyed. And once that has happened, we then need to build or relocate people. So these are just examples. One from Eastern Cape, that's Port St. John's, the first two series, where when the floods hit in 2019, that homestead basically was abandoned and the new homestead built under certain arrangements. In Zimbabwe, in Chimanimani, that homestead was abandoned and a new one relocated and built. So now this is going to be now where the money matter is going to be raised. And that's why possibly developing countries are making a lot of noise to say we need funding towards loss and damage. You're saying this is actually permanent loss. We have not spoken about maybe even compensating lost human life. Yes, we are not going to bring a person back, but we might need to compensate for those that have left behind. It's around agriculture and infrastructure being destroyed and also needing to rebuild it and building it back. I'm almost closing now, Program Director. So we are saying that the battle for loss and damage is not yet over. And you know, I'm raising the issue there to say half a loaf remains so. I'm now talking from the arguments where during COP27, the world concluded a deal to discuss more on loss and damage during COP28 and subsequent COPs. Then you are saying they continue wondering, are these cyclones, floods, and sea level rises going to wait for COP28? No, they are not. And I'm saying the action is needed and is needed yesterday. We simply do not have time to be gathering and talking. And hence, from my own advocacy, half a loaf remains half a loaf. And I'm saying we were told when we were growing up to say with our colonial masters, they told us half a loaf is better than nothing. And this is what has killed us, not only as a humanity, especially people from the South and even human rights, because we think half a loaf is better than nothing. At times, you need to turn away and leave the half a loaf there, because that half a loaf can be dangerous in terms of what it brings. There's no business for us, maybe as people of the South, getting 100,000 or 1 billion or 100 million US dollars annually. And we are saying that 100 million US dollars can make us get tied to so many issues that we might fail to address what we need to address. So we are saying the would-be deal on loss and damage remains highly contested because developed nations fear litigation from their old sins. And the pending loss and damage deal has many strings, including what I call the unholy matrimony with high school type demands to have developing countries report progress towards net zero emissions by 2050 from the EU and its friends. And what I'm simply saying here is, as developing countries, we need to be very careful in terms of what we agree to. So we cannot agree to a loss and damage fund that is going to make us want to report on net zero emissions, of which some of the countries don't even have the emissions to report. There are small countries, not to say I'm mocking them. When you talk about Lesotho, you're talking about Rwanda, you're talking about Burundi, you're talking about Reunion, and maybe all these small island states, they don't have a lot of emissions to report upon. And then such conditions, say, give us reports on net zero transition, then might be unfair things. This is the last slide. What must Africa do with our green metals? So I'm saying that as a continent, when I'm talking about when we've put the whole sum or the total sum in terms of green metals, loss and damage, and also human rights issues, and looking or coming from the future. So when you come from the future, I see a future where the whole of the African continent is left empty, no green metals, the metals that are going to be driving that net zero that is being demanded by our masters. And we've got all the deposits that now being reserves in China, being reserves in EU, being reserves in Australia, being reserves in US. As a matter of fact, Canada now has banned a lot of Chinese companies that were involved in these strategic metals from doing business in that country. So we have seen countries now being companies from China and other places being stopped from continuing to exploit these strategic resources. So in the same way, I'm saying if we're going to address human rights and coming from the future, especially from a development perspective, we have to come together as a continent and be a bit clever in terms of how we are going to protect these green metals and also the human rights. So it will be actually a misnomer. It's actually against the human rights to say 50 years from now, we have got 0 green metals on the continent. And our children are going to say, what was happening? Where were we when all these things were happening? And I'm saying, apart from raising awareness, I'm also raising advocacy in terms of how best do we address this matter, or which is a human rights issue, to say all the green metals are being exploited from the continent. And I'm saying that we need actually to make progressive noises regarding what belongs to the continent. And when it comes to African green metals movement, which I'm saying there, we need to propose. We actually need to also have our youth, our women, and everybody else coming to the table to say, this is how we are going to address some of these issues, because they are human rights issues that go beyond just exploiting the green metals and other minerals and exporting them. So I am saying time has come for us to turn all the roads to the hinterland. I'm saying the roads are coming from the hinterland, and that is our masters or colonial era period that we are still in. In this generation, we need our government to start thinking about turning the roads back to the hinterland. And how do we turn the roads back to the hinterland as a human rights issue? We need then to have manufacturing plants. We need to set up these battery manufacturing plants. We need to set up these solar panel manufacturing plants, wind turbine manufacturing plants. All these issues that are needed for the net zero emissions by 2050, we must actually benefit it on the continent. We talk about regional value chains. If we can't do it in South Africa, we can have one factory in Rwanda, one factory in DRC, one factory in Zambia, one factory in Mozambique, as long as we are going to beneficiate these green metals and make sure that we address poverty through this and also value add. So these are some of the issues that we say when we talk about human rights, climate change, loss and damage, net zero, we need to address. 3 points to conclude. There will be no just transition to net zero emissions by 2050 in Africa and other developing regions without accounting for the global carbon sinks resulting from exploitation of these green metals. Number 2, African and other scholars need to provide methodologies and baselines for accounting for carbon credits from these green metals. Number 3, a continued neglect in accounting for the exploitation of green metals in the context of net zero emissions by 2050 and the imminent depletion of such from the African continent remains a serious human rights violation and unjust. I will stop here and I'll be happy to engage if there is time. Over to you, Program Director.
Thank you, Prof. Namo. I'm actually feeling a bit guilty. I hope I didn't rush you. You sounded quite in a rushed mode, but let's just look at how you could possibly contribute more with questions that may come from the floor, but also when we have Prof. Thenjiwe responding to what the two panel members have shared with us. What has taken my fancy, though, those that were in this morning's Sustainability Indaba will see the connections between what our two panel members have made reference to in terms of inclusivity, the importance of sustainability, and the importance indeed of justice and accountability. I'm actually listening to you and cannot afford not to appreciate the fact that it's like all of you were in one room looking at the fact that let's stop chatting, let's stop talking. Much as the series that are moderating refer to as Asikhulume, let's talk, let's chat. But what I'm hearing from you, as you've so loudly demonstrated through you raising your hand, you're saying that enough action, enough talking, action is needed. Your reference to half a loaf is what it is, half a loaf, that is what it is. Let's have progressive noises. So with all of this shared by Prof. Namo, without wanting to get into the respondents' work that's upcoming, I'm inviting a maximum of 2 questions or comments from the patrons to direct to Prof. Namo, and by extension to a certain degree, one of our panel members that could not make it, that is Professor Dr. Lerato Kumal of climate change at Exxaro, related very much to Prof. Namo. Let's hear any questions, points to take note of here. Let me just kick off then. I'm drawing, Prof. Namo, connections between the question that was asked by Dr. Lo Thelma Lo, when she made mention of the fact that we seem to be in a catch-22 situation as it relates to, on one end, we've been saying let's go green, but with that happening, we are also seeming to be having exacerbated unemployment rates, because when you have less coal being transported, as Dr. Lowe has made reference to, then we will have less people employed. So my question to you, or possible comment, will be, what's your thinking around what you've made reference to in terms of listening to you talking more about economics? Of course, one would not expect you to do otherwise, given the specialization. But what should Africa do? Taking this consideration that your very last slide, last but one, made reference to green metals. With these green metals, how do we, as you are advocating, producing these green metals by the plants that you're advocating should be set up within the African continent, which will promote the intra-Africa trade? That, by the way, on Friday, we're having the Deputy President of Liberia speaking to us, who's an economist herself, speaking to us about these matters. But my question to you is, how do you balance the two, wherein we could have to be, as we continue contributing as a continent through green metals, but how do we do that with less capital as Africa seems to have, but do that cognizant of what you're also advocating in terms of let's go green, while we're also exploiting the green metals that we have. So a part of me is feeling a bit confused about that, and I'm thinking, are you not contradicting yourself? Much as we want to see development, but we also want these plans set up to exploit further what we have from our green resources. Prof. Namo, your sense?
Thank you, Program Director. It's quite an interesting, yeah. My intention was not to leave you a bit confused, but it's good even if you are confused, because that's exactly how the subject is like. So the fact of the matter here is the full story. When you look at when you consider Africa as a continent, and we consider how much carbon or how much damage you are causing in the atmosphere. Remember, we all emit into the same atmosphere. So I'm saying there, when you consider the damage Africa has put or is doing into the atmosphere now, in terms of the carbon measured or carbon dioxide equivalent measured, it's less than 5% of the global total. Now, this is one side. Then the other side, so it means the 25%, the 95% plus is not even coming from the continent. Then the other part, which is like it is, when you consider now that Africa has got the forest, we've got actually the Congo Basin and other forests that perform the role of what we call carbon sink, that basically eats up carbon. Then we can if we get the sum total. If we get the sum total of that, what is interesting is we may reach a point where the noise that is being made is unwarranted. So I'm saying the noise of 5% of carbon emissions from the continent versus the forest we have, and now we add the green metals that are adding to that agenda of reducing the carbon emissions. So far, we don't know how much we are contributing from the green metals. And one of my academic questions there was, we need then to know exactly what does a ton of copper, how much carbon is being forgone by a ton of copper, we can actually have a carbon footprint of from mining the copper, maybe transporting to a point of entry, and wherever it's going, whether it's going to make 3 batteries or 1 battery, whatever. We are saying that knowledge we don't have now. And this is where I'm saying academics need to put their minds together, because we need to know how much carbon sinks are we performing from these green metals that are being taken day in, day and night from the continent, being stockpiled elsewhere, which we are not going to have if we're not careful. So I'm saying it's a strategic resource that our countries and the African continent need to come together to say, hey guys, this is what is happening. We need to look at this. Now, why then does it become contradictory? We are saying when you talk the sum total of the forest, the green metals we have, and the amount that we are emitting, if we remove South Africa, for example, we emit less than 2% of the global carbon emissions. So that argument has always been suffocated and saying, but these countries are growing. And I'm saying the time for us then to put our pedal completely from coal is not now. We all need energy, what we call energy mix, or energy mix on board. We need coal, we need renewables. So it's not coal or, it's coal and. So the fact of coal and is what brings the equality to everything. So I'm saying we need to be responsible people in terms of exploiting the resources we have. So the core resource is what we have. The oil resource is what we have. We have other resources that are actually covering us as a continent or as a country in terms of the emissions. So I'm not saying let's exploit unresponsibly. We exploit as we find solutions. Now, this is the argument that then came from COP26 to say, no, we can't say no to coal now. We are saying let's exploit coal into the future, exploiting it responsibly to allow a soft landing. So as renewable energies are coming in, we should not be left too far at the corner. We should continue exploiting the coal. I'm not being very clear. Continue exploiting the coal. Then, as we are exploiting the coal, we need to bring other energy mixes on board, which actually are also being peddled by these green metals that I'm saying we are not yet accounting for how much carbon sinks or how much carbon are we removing. So I'm saying if we get the net equation of our carbon emissions as a continent, we might discover that we have a net negative carbon emission. It's only that no academic and other people have computed this to put it on the table and argue to say, as a continent, we have possibly a net negative carbon emission. So if you've got a net negative carbon emission, the issue of coal will not even come into the picture. So what I'm saying here is I'm challenging every academic listening and those that maybe might see this YouTube to say, we need actually to have the figures to say, what is our net emission as a continent? Is it positive or is it negative? Hopefully I'm not confusing you more, Prof Meyiwa, but my argument is simple. We need to have the facts on the table so that we can say, as Africa, do we have a net carbon emission, net negative or net positive? I believe if we've got those figures on the table, then we can have an informed decision in terms of where we are going. Thank you and over.
Thanks, Prof. Namo, for that. We have a hand from Sosten. A part of me was thinking, is this the Minister of Malawi? Is that Sosten? Can we have you?
I wish I was a minister. Please, can you hear me?
Loud and clear, Minister.
All right. Just an ordinary academic. Yes, thank you for the wonderful presentations. Prof. Namo, I like your parallel with the slave trade that involved people now with the green minerals. I was in Blantyre, Scotland last week, following up on the history of Livingstone. And one of the things that they mentioned there is the chiefs, the African chiefs, being part and parcel of the slave trade. To what extent is that replaying today in the green metal trade, and what are the solutions? Otherwise, we find ourselves being in a situation where the vulnerable and the hopeless, not able to do anything, even though they see the challenges. But the most powerful, just like the chiefs during the old slave trade, get in bed with those that are exploiting unsustainably our resources. What is your comment on that?
Thanks, Prof. Chiota. Welcome to our series. I think that is a very good observation. So, unlike maybe in the slave trade, there will always be middle people, or middlemen, middle women, who aid these developments. So, to start with, we have, for example, in any country, African country or beyond, we have people that have got resources. Number one, we have got people that have got knowledge. So I'm worried mainly about people that have got knowledge. So you see, the people that have got knowledge include people that are outside the continent. A good scenario is possibly the best geological map for Zimbabwe or best soils map for Rwanda. Best soils map for Rwanda is in Belgium, sitting there in Belgium. And possibly the best geological map for Zimbabwe is sitting in the UK. And you know, this is why at times the stranglehold on us as former colonies is driven by the power of data and knowledge. So there is a lot that we don't know now at the continent that people that were our former masters know. So with technology like GIS, remote sensing, everything, all these deposits, people don't just fly from USA, UK, US, and everywhere for nothing. They already have everything at their fingertips. They even know which part do I need to go and peg or ask for a minerals or mining claim. So I'm saying there, when then that comes, the communities at times don't even know. So if for example, a guy from China comes, get to a traditional chief, give that traditional chief 50,000, because in the following week, that 50,000 is going to multiply in numbers we have never seen, then the traditional chief is okay with 50,000. But I'm saying our governments and lawyers for human rights need to be in the thick of things to say the country need to know what it is. So if, for example, I can say, give me a geological map of Malawi, we might not have an updated geological map. You might give me a geological map done in the colonial era, 1920s. And I'm saying that is what is killing us as countries now and is perpetuating human rights violations. Because by the end of the day, when the mine is discovered, I have not seen many places where these local communities that are being removed are given a real stake. The Rio Bafokeng was one of the examples that could be shining. I don't know to what extent it's still shining, but I am saying when these local communities, when these minerals are discovered, we really need a stake. I'm tempted to say we should not give these companies full rights. We should give these companies either mining rights, the land remains ours. If you think that the company is not doing what we want, they are on a lease. They are on a lease agreement, and that lease can be terminated. But we have seen a situation where these companies, they come, they ask for tax holidays. They are taking those green minerals under tax holidays. 5 years come, the tax holidays are off, the company just disappears into thin air. These are things that we have known. Ramatex in Namibia, in the textiles industry, did it. And these challenges are not uncommon. So we need to say that for us to protect abuse of the local communities, we need the proper advocacy. We need the proper governance structures. And like I'm saying, unfortunately, where there is exploitation, somebody is aiding them. It could even be a past government legislation. Well, I'll just give you an example that's outside here. There are a lot of laws that are coming that are banning traditional seed. And now in the agriculture sector. And these laws are being passed in our parliaments, Uganda, Kenya, all over South Africa. Laws that are banning traditional seed. Because traditional seed, what does it do? It contaminates the hybrid seed. Who is running with this hybrid seed? Companies like Monsanto, Pana, all those companies. And what is going to happen when all the traditional seed has been cleaned up? We are going to be left with the no seed and the hybrid seed. What do they need? They need fertilizers, they need ABCD. So I'm saying it's a system that needs to be looked at closely and say, how do we address matters of human rights within this climate change and its extension? Like I'm giving you in the agriculture sector, that is an extension. So those issues then need to be clearly looked at And we really need people on the ground to be at least aware to say when these things are happening, how do they react? How do they become a strong group? Even if it is a mall going to Soweto, we can't release the land. Let's give the land, let's give the lease, the mall GEM can build a mall there, but the land should never belong to GEM. They can sit their building there, rent the land, so that the communities there, they can perpetually benefit, rather than say, when GEM comes or another multinational company comes, we give them both the land, we give them the water rights, and all the other rights that comes with that. And those issues have been so thorny in terms of local communities because their rights are effectively taken away when development comes in the name of employment. And I'm saying employment alone is not enough. And when talk to climate change now, when the houses are being destroyed, people are sitting on sloppy land because there's no land, and then we blame climate change. It's also not correct. So as governments, there are also issues that we need to talk there. We can't just push all the blame towards climate change, because some of these blames that we put on climate change is nothing to do with climate change. People come, they sit on waterways, the water does what it does, the houses are swept, then we blame climate change. So these are also other issues that we are saying, as we're going to be addressing human rights, climate change and issues, we also need to address how are we dealing with our planning matters. So we cannot have a situation where government or governments across the continent allow people to settle on mountain slopes, settle on riverbeds, 50 kilometers within high flood zones, and then when the water comes, we blame climate change. That is not so as well. So these are some of the matters that are interesting. Yes.
He's so passionate. Thanks, Prof. Namo, for that. I'm not going to give you this question. We have a question from the YouTube community that says, what about the scarcity or basically lack of renewability of coal? I would like if Tumela could wait for us a bit. I've gone into the time of a respondent that I want to introduce now. These roundtables are only meant for 2 hours, and we want to keep them to be 2 hours because we don't want people to be getting tired of them, because we have 4 a year. So that's the 2 hours that we want to know that when you become a patron of the Asikhulume Roundtable discussions, you know that we won't take more than 2 hours of your time. We now have 30 minutes before we finish the roundtable time schedule. And I want at this point to request that, Tumelo, I've noted your question. I want us to get Prof. Dube, Kaitano Dube to respond. Prof. Dube is an import. We've imported him from the tourism geography department at the Vaal University of Technology. He's actually a tourism geography professor. Possible, Prof. Dube, you may want to respond to the question as a person with the geography expertise to the question that's been posed by a YouTube patron. Prof. Dube, Kaitano Dube, that is currently a Faculty of Human Science Research, Innovation and Commercialization professor, acting and as well as ecotourism management lecturer. So he's best positioned to do this. He is an NRF-rated researcher who supervises a number of master's and doctoral students. Just by summarizing his resume, and he's an editor for Cogent Social Sciences, that is the tourism section of that. And he's published quite extensively books, book chapters, journal articles in high impact peer-reviewed journals within a short period of time, looking at his CV. So he's also an advisor to a number of governments, several governments and local governments. And I'm thinking that he's best positioned. I'm going to put you on the spot now here to respond to Dumelo's question. What about the scarcity or basically lack of renewability of coal? So if you could respond, in your response, take into cognizance what Dumelo has posed through our YouTube community. Over to you, please, Gaetano.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Meyiwa, and thank you very much, Prof Namo and Jessica for the, I think for the wonderful presentation. I think that we have enjoyed, I think, which have raised quite a number of questions. I'm trying to understand the gist of the question that came from the YouTube channel. Maybe if it can be rephrased, I might be able to assist in that regard.
I think the question is asking, probably Prof Namo may respond to this because he's advocating for hybrid, not just only abandoning coal. Using his words, he said we need to land softly.
Yes.
So Tumelo's question, I'm thinking, comes from that statement where, but is coal renewable? That's the question that he's asking. And he's saying, what about the scarcity or lack of the fact that coal is not renewable? You don't have to respond to it. It was directed to the Exxaro chair.
Okay.
We'll have him later, but this is your time. If you could do this in the next 10 minutes or so, Prof, to just respond, and then we will get the two panel members to also respond to your response and finalize. Over to you, please, Prof.
Great. Thank you very much. My former Vice Chancellor, I think she has forgotten that she gave me 2 merit awards in 2017 and 2018 as the best PhD on the Research Symposium. So I'm glad to be back home. I think SABC2 will say where I belong. But I think from the presentation, what is quite clear, what is coming quite clear, is the fact that we are all faced with a climate crisis, and this is particularly due to anthropogenic or human activities that have released a lot of carbon emissions. Because we are in a cloud of a disaster. The global village is fighting to apportion blame at each other. And I'm not so sure, maybe from our respondents, in as much as we appreciate that some of these, both the onset disasters and also the extreme weather events that we have been experiencing, particularly over the past decade, whether this is a noble thing for the world to be doing at this particular juncture, to try and apportion blame as to who needs to pay for what. Is it the most prudent thing to do when there's a disaster for the world to actually be embroiled in spending time, trying to apportion blame, and to say from that perspective, who then must foot for the crisis that we are in? And I think with particular reference to the issue around the loss and damage, I think one of the critical issues, in as much as this has been sharply raised, particularly by the developing world, we also have, I think, voices that are raising issues that has to do with climate change attribution. So if we look at the onset events and we look at our extreme weather events, and we know that these extreme weather events and all slow onset events, they have upset, I think, social, economic, and also environmental rights, so to speak. But what we don't know is, I think from a climate change or a science perspective, one of the biggest challenges I think that the world is facing, which I would want the respondents maybe to talk to, is to say in terms of our science. For example, if we look at the Durban flooding, for example, as a classic example, to what extent in terms of the damage and loss, because we have these natural events known to be occurring in certain particular regions. If we look at tropical cyclones, we know that these particular events normally would occur. But we know also that climate change has amplified some of these extreme weather events or slow onset events. How do we then, I think in terms of calculating the damage, how do we then apportion that particular cost, particularly from a single event, and come up with quantifiable numbers? And I think what also came out is the issue of, in as much as we blame some of the damages that we have seen in recent events to climate change, to what extent do we also apportion some of these damages and some of these losses, I think, which has been problematic, to misgovernance, to poor planning on part of our governments. And one of the things I think that we have also witnessed in terms of, in as much as our negotiations for better deals when we go to Conference of Parties, the recent one having been hosted in Africa, who, in terms of who dictates the certain positions that are actually adopted, particularly by developing countries? Is it really the voice of the marginalized? Is it really the voice of the women? Is it really the voice, particularly of the elderly people who are at the backlash of climate change, which ends up being on the table, or the negotiation table, as it were? I think these are some of the issues that we really need to talk to. I think Prof Meyiwa also spoke about the issue of tech transfer, which is actually a very good thing. But I think from what we have seen, we have also seen, particularly as a result of COVID-19, we saw a number of aircrafts being retired. But with the tourism industry now coming to life, we have seen some of the old aircraft that were retired in the West coming to Africa. To what extent do we take responsibility, the governments in Southern Africa, the governments in Africa, take responsibility some of the policies that we adopt, which might be counterproductive in terms of the protection of the reduction of carbon emissions? And then whilst we are there, we see that there's a lot of opportunities that come as a result of climate change. Some of these technology comes both in terms of adaptation and mitigation. As university higher educations as higher education institutions, to what extent are we leveraging, I think, our positions in terms of research and innovation? How much are we contributing to ensure that we have this technology and they are relevant and they are suitable for use by our people and adapted to our environment? There is also an issue that has arisen because of climate change, particularly when we talk about climate change mitigation, which has been spoken to by both Prof Namo and Jessica, that one of the things that is being done is climate change mitigation, which is actually a very good thing. But we have also seen that climate change is big trade and big business, particularly when we talk about the carbon market. And in terms of that particular carbon market, how much have we as a continent been able to leverage from these carbon markets? How many carbon markets, how many carbon accredited companies do we have, so that we sort of gain and get some of these finances that can actually be utilized by Africa, both in terms of assisting it to adapt and also in terms of its adaptation strategies? And as higher education institutions, what is our role and how far have we gone in this regard? We have seen a lot of uptake, particularly during COVID-19. We saw a lot of inventions. We saw a lot of research that was invested in COVID-19. Are we seeing the same kind of vigor, the same kind of excitement when it comes to climate change? We also know that in terms of most of our governments, you've got a carbon tax that is actually also placed, I think, to kind of assist in terms of pollution reduction. To what extent is this particular money, the carbon tax particularly, being leveraged to assist Africa in terms of its adaptation and also mitigation? I think these are some of the things that we really need to look at. When we talk about climate justice, who exactly is a beneficiary of climate justice? Is it the poor person who is in Mpumalanga, or is the politician that is there? And how do we sort of assist these particularly the most vulnerable people to access some of the benefits that comes with the discussion around climate justice. The quantification of carbon sequestration capacity, I think, is a noble idea. But to what extent is this particular debate going to assist us in terms of where we want to go towards carbon neutrality in 2050? I think I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Dube. I hope I didn't rush you. The approach, which I know I'm naughty, I'm such a bad child, as my mom would say, despite me being so elderly now. In between, I had allowed that there are some discussions. So if you have a sense that you were rushed, you may want to continue, or you may want to further respond to the responses of the two panel members, that is the lawyer, Advocate Lawrence, Attorney Lawrence, that is Jessica, who spoke about justice, that is environmental rights, as well as the Prof Namo on climate change-related loss and change. So at this time, thank you so much. Let me just thank you for responding with such a number of questions. Prof Namo has put on the chat, colleagues, something that we may want to be, he's responding. Some of it, we could use the chat box as well. A colleague of mine whom I recently did work with is asking Prof Namo actually, why are cyclone names largely women's names? I don't know how Prof Namo may want to respond to that, but thanks, Prof Dube, for your responses that were actually very good in the sense that they're posing questions, the questions that are being posed here. So at this juncture, I want to allow Jessica to respond as you deem fit, Jessica. And when you do so, I actually should be leading by example to show my face. As you do so, if you could just show your face in terms of the comments that we've had and the number of questions that have been posed by our respondents. He's posed too many questions that really spinned my head much more than it was spent by both of you earlier on. So we'll start with Jessica and Prof Godwell in that order, please.
Thank you so much. Just with response to the question from Tumelo from YouTube about the scarcity or the lack of renewability of coal, I think that's a really important question, and I think that's part of the discussion of moving to clean and green energy, is that we shouldn't be relying on fossil fuels because of course we know they are finite, and also just because of the harmful impact that burning of coal has on the environment and the health of people who live within the vicinity of coal mining and coal plants. So it really is those two aspects which forms part of the reason why we ought to move away from burning of coal for energy. With regards to the question with what has been achieved with the Paris Agreement, I think the Paris Agreement is quite an unusual hybrid agreement because it has quite big ambitions, but very few enforcement mechanisms within the actual agreement. And every country that signs onto the promise to lower the global temperatures have failed, and to lower the global temperatures and to wean off fossil fuels for energy, have failed to meet those goals. And what has resulted in that is that countries are now allowed to come up with their own goals and plans on how to move away from the burning of fossil fuels and how to accomplish the commitment to lower the global temperature. But failing short of meeting these goals, there is very few mechanisms or penalties that can hold countries accountable to that commitment. There have been a number of things that has recently allowed nations to strengthen their initial pledges, by promising to cut their net climate emissions by 2050. And some examples is the European Union, Canada, South Korea, Japan, South Africa, the United Kingdom have all made these pledges. And I know that the US President Joe Biden has also promised to make climate change a priority and center of his presidency. But we still have other states like China, which is one of the single largest sources of emissions, who have failed to cut their emissions as initially promised. But they've aimed to reduce, at this stage, they haven't cut their emissions, but they have aimed to do so by 2060. So we are still far off 2050 and 2060. And unfortunately, at this stage, we haven't seen many states making progress towards their commitments in terms of the Paris Agreement. But this was a topic at COP27, and we hope that countries recommit themselves to lowering their emissions and moving away from fossil fuels. I think those are probably the only questions that I could probably respond to.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I want to pick it from where Jessica is leaving it in terms of core. So, to me, this is quite an interesting dynamic, maybe possibly ambivalence. So when a country goes to the World Bank to say we want to talk about just transition, that does not simply sit well with me. The business of banking is banking. And like what Friedman says, the business of business is business. So when you go to a bank to say we want just transition, to me, that is not the correct route to go. I'm of the view that we need to raise our resources domestically by addressing governance challenges. There's a lot of leakage in terms of financial resources that maybe a country like South Africa might not even need to go to the World Bank. There are many other countries like Nigeria, they've got resources. They might not even need to go to the World Bank. So when you go to the World Bank, regardless of whether maybe most of those loans are not concessional, they are not free loans. There is some kind of a penalty that we know comes with getting money from a development bank. So what I'm simply saying there is like, yes, there's a lot of noise that is being made around transition from coal. I agree with transition from coal. But what I don't agree with is that the manner in which it should be done. It's like you want to do it abruptly, run to the World Bank, get money for the country, get a mortgage for the country, then move away from coal. So what? You move away from coal, then you impoverish your people. That is not how just transition works. We are talking about human rights here. So when we're talking about human rights, we want to see that it's being done in a fair manner. So we are not saying don't move away from coal. We are saying do it in a fair manner, in a just manner. There are families that are dependent on this industry. And like we had said, these resources are not in perpetuity. At some point, the coal mine is going to shut down and you still have a problem with rehabilitating it or converting it to another use. So I'm saying here, as we do what we call a soft landing, then that soft landing can also then allow a government to prepare a core community to transitioning to other uses. Maybe they're going to go agricultural if it is in Mpumalanga, they're going to go solar, maybe they're going to migrate to other areas. But to bring a gun to say, now, stop coal now is what we are saying, it's unjust, it's unfair. And this is why from COP26, India yet to be the voice of India and other countries was yet to say, let's then talk about a soft landing. So we are advocating for a soft landing because soft landing brings justice. We are not saying the core was going to be there in perpetuity. So this is why I say we need all energy mixes on board so that when we are talking about this just transition, human rights and core, then we know that people are not going to be stranded. We are not also even going to have stranded assets. And I'm saying we can, at times we might not then start. So one other human rights issue is like we can't then start investing a lot in an industry that we know is going to terminate at some point, maybe 40 or 30 years from now, because we also don't want stranded assets. So we are also trying to avoid this idea of stranded assets. We're saying when we just say no coal today, then we are going to have stranded assets. By the way, the African continent has put a position to say we are going to address all energy mixes. We are going to bring all energy mixes on board, and they have not put a year to which all these issues are going to end, especially using coal, using oil. So by the end of the day, the continental view is also saying, let's have justice in what we are doing. Just to answer something that was there in the chat in terms of why the names of cyclones, that was a traditional way. Now we've got a lot of other names that are male names as well. Cyclone Japhet, Cyclone Kenneth, these are not women as far as I'm concerned, being also sensitive in some form. So like I'm saying, there's a book we've published which talks about how cyclones are named, why they are named that way, and what happens when the names get finished. By the way, the names can get finished in a season. They've been doing so quite often this generation, because we're experiencing a lot of these cyclones, hurricanes, typhoons, depending on the region that you are coming from. But I want to sign off by saying, when it comes to climate change and human rights, we need to separate two major issues. There are human rights, climate change associated human rights. Then there are bad planning associated human rights. So that needs to be clear from the onset. Part of what Prof Thenjiwe was saying, which I highlighted earlier, some of the issues we are highlighting as climate change challenges are basically bad human decisions. You go and sit in a flood zone, you will get flooded. So you go and put your house in a flood zone, it's going to be swept, not because of climate change, but because of what is happening. But there are also other intra-regional issues that I did not highlight now that are very, very sensitive. Issues like, where is the water from Exxaro, if you're in South Africa, coming? It's coming to Pretoria. What is happening in Exxaro? New settlements, new malls are being set on wetlands. And when that happens, that water is going to come to Pretoria. And I tell you, maybe in the future, we will need boats to get to our houses because they will be flooded. And this is not a matter to laugh about. These issues, then we're talking about intra-regional planning. How do we then talk about intra-regional planning? Because remember, the climate change challenge is coming on top of existing challenges. You drive along R21, for those that are in South Africa, to the airport, to Pretoria, it's now all warehousing. All the agricultural land is gone. Where is that runoff water going to go? It will find its way into Pretoria and other low-lying areas and aggravate the challenges of flooding. So these are actually the real-life situations we are going to face. So we really need to talk, when I talk about human rights, we really need to put all these issues into play. And also go beyond just human rights. Thank you, and I am signing off.
Thank you. Thanks, Prof. Namo, for that, and thanks to Jessica for the responses. I'm actually moving towards signing off as well. In conclusion, much of these discussions have been ongoing in between, but your reference, Prof. Namo, to the water crisis and the state of not just only this country's water, but global water has been highlighted, I think, if I'm not mistaken, at the COP27, with some statistics indicating that soon, of course, possible, some of us will be long gone by then, around the 2050, we will have in one day more than 4 billion people per day being not able to access water, for instance. We know how we have had challenges with that. So with that said, I have to relay gratitude to the organizers of this roundtable, the 8th roundtable. I know it has been a hard one to put together, given the time of the year and the hectic conditions within the university. And for that, I don't take this for granted. It's a lot of work, months on end, before we realize a roundtable. I want to also thank the panel members who have shared their expertise from the last one, that is Prof Thenjiwe's response as a geography professor, geography and tourism professor, going to Jessica Lawrence with the human rights, with her passion being there, not only ending there, but if you follow her work, the human rights work that she does in advocating for those that are vulnerable, that we thank very much. And with Prof Namo's responses and all the challenges that are being brought to us in terms of let's be advocates ourselves and let's not go begging. And you know, your last reference to the World Bank question begging that we've put there really does pose a question to us all. Indeed, it's been a very informative, educational webinar that we've enjoyed. And I say so, speaking on behalf of my colleagues, the patrons of this afternoon's AIDS Roundtable Asikhulume on climate change and human rights, looking at what could we do beyond COP27 and take the advocacy. And with that, wanting to thank the patrons of this Asikhulume Roundtable series, as well as those that are participating on YouTube, that this shall be recorded on YouTube should you need it for future use. And I must actually thank the university as a whole, that this week has been a week in which the university focuses its gaze on matters of climate crisis and wanting to check on what we are doing wrong, what we could do differently, and where to from here, and where we are taking a stock of what we need to do, and also share the information in terms of what's being done within the university and our partners as well. It has really come to hearten my soul so much that we see more not competition, but between universities, among universities and science councils, the sharing of information as well as advice across the board. And indeed, that's the route that we should be taking for us to significantly have an impact on the climate crisis that we're facing now, which for some of us who are not involved in the science part of it, you will be experiencing it every day as you move out of your house, which are hopefully is clean and tidy, not like my daughter's bedrooms. That's a debate for another day. You see the papers all over, plastic flying around, hanging on the cables, being all over the place. You just want to go back to your bedroom that's cleaner than what you get to expose yourself to. So just from that point of view, you just realize how much we are polluting, even as individuals, by the use of the plastic bag or the lack of reusing that one plastic bag a zillion times when you go shopping, for instance. With that said, I want to thank everyone and wish you a good afternoon and evening ahead, and hope that in 2023 you will continue to support this series going forward. And I promise that we keep them to 2 hours, but become 2 hours of packed information and debates that are worthwhile, while we also share research expertise and skills expertise across the board. Thank you very much. Asante, Ngiyabonga. Goodbye.
Thank you, Chairperson. Goodbye, colleagues.
Thank you. Goodbye. Bye.
Bye, colleagues.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye, colleagues. Bye, colleagues.
Hi, Sentia. I'm just seeing my team now. I'm going to have to actually exit.
Hi, Prof.
Are you able to exit colleagues that
that have not yet? I'll do that. I'll do so.
Yes, so that we chat a bit. I think this was really a successful one, very pertinent.
Prof, hold on a second, please. Hold on, Prof. Guys, can you be quiet down there? Sorry, Prof. I couldn't hear you. The kids were making noise.
Who's that? Who?
We do. I hope we have stopped recording there.
Yes, we have.
Yes.
Thank you. Good.
Okay,
Prof?
thanks, we do for that. Thank you so much, colleagues, for this. Just a brief thank you to you directly as people who've been directors in the background and somehow also moderators assisting me with this task. I don't take this for granted, not for a second, and want to appreciate and express gratitude for really putting us on the map, appreciating the fact that we have too many things happening at the same day at Unisa.
Absolutely.
Just today we had two other climate change, SGD functions and events on the same day.
I saw that, yes.
As she said, there was also one at the College of Engineering Science and Technology.
Yes.
But even people that were complaining that we have to split ourselves into multiple pieces. But that as it may be, it possibly does show not just a besachate ways, but also the importance of the subject. And I mean, the fact that you chose this subject, it's just drawn so much interest. A number of colleagues have not been able to come through because of their commitments, but they have asked that they access the YouTube, and I'm just hoping that the YouTube is accessible. Such colleagues are in the geography and environmental studies of MUT, for instance, who thought they were going to be available but can't.
Yeah, no problem, Prof. We're going to keep this alive a little bit on social media, and with the YouTube link, so that our impact can at least be increased in that way. But yeah, we've had quite a few RSVPs, but as you said, obviously last minute commitments. Even one of our speakers last minute into the last half an hour. So no, it's understandable. But no, thank you very much for giving us this platform, and we will continue doing the good work.
Thank you so much.
Me and my
for
team.
all the other good work that you're doing. It's just amazing. I get so excited and somehow ambivalent. But one time, one day I hate Unisa so much, the following day I love Unisa. So I'm kind of like a chameleon, given the complexities and multiplicity activities and events that we get exposed to and all the successes. Thank you so much, colleagues. I appreciate it.
A real pleasure, Prof. I also want to say thank you to Damakatso and Mdude that was in the background there. Yeah, and Dr. Ntwesani also in the background there.
Yeah,
right,
I know. I can see both and Mdu's work and Dr. Ntwesani's work behind the scenes.
Right.
And the marketing that has gone with this. And I liked how you actually gave a fresh look to the invitation as well.
Right.
I really like that.
Okay.
I'm not quite sure whether green is the Unisa press color that you're picking on from the new
from the new CI.
that you're using.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, we'll continue with that green. All right. Okay, Prof. Thank you for your time, and we shall chat.
For you, it's a pity that we can't have a huge dinner. We'll see. We'll have it online or somehow. But my heart is with your heart and beating the same. Thank you so much to the four of you. Goodbye.
Bye then.
Bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you very much. Well done. Well done, guys. One other successful event. Sure.